There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles over you like winter frost when you realize the truth. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but something far more devastating, the loneliness of seeing what others refuse to see, of understanding what they choose to ignore, of carrying awareness that makes you unwelcome in the very world you're trying to navigate. You opened your eyes too wide. You looked too deeply into the human heart, into the mechanisms of suffering, into the patterns that govern how people lie to themselves and each other. And now, something strange has happened. The people around you have gone quiet, not the comfortable silence of companionship, but the cold silence of distance, the silence that comes when you've crossed an invisible line, when you've seen something you weren't supposed to see, when you've become too conscious for their comfort. They don't argue with you anymore. They don't engage. They simply withdraw. Their eyes slide away when you speak. Their responses become polite and empty. Conversations that once flowed naturally now feel like crossing a minefield. You can feel the shift in every interaction, the way people lean slightly away from you, the way they change the subject when you approach, the way invitations stop coming, the way your presence seems to create a subtle tension that wasn't there before. And you understand, with a sinking clarity, that you've been marked, not for doing anything wrong, but for seeing too much, for perceiving the unspoken truths that hold their illusions together, for recognizing the games people play, the masks they wear, the lies they tell themselves to avoid facing what's real. They sense this awareness in you, and it terrifies them, so they punish you with silence, with withdrawal, with the slow, quiet erasure of your place in their world. And you're left wondering, how did seeing clearly become a crime? When did honesty become exile? Why does understanding cost you connection? Let me tell you something that Dostoevsky understood in the marrow of his bones, something he wrote about in every single one of his great works. You are not being punished because you did something wrong. You are experiencing what happens when consciousness advances beyond the collective agreement, when your soul refuses to participate in the shared delusions that keep society comfortable. The silence you're receiving is not rejection, it is recognition. They see in you what they refuse to see in themselves, and that mirror, that unbearable reflection of truth, makes you dangerous to their carefully constructed sense of safety. You are not too much. You are not broken. You are not cruel or cynical or cold. You have simply crossed a threshold that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You've seen the scaffolding behind the stage. You've glimpsed the mechanisms that drive human behavior. You've understood the desperate ways people cling to comforting lies rather than face uncomfortable truths. And this understanding has changed you in ways that cannot be hidden. It shows in your eyes. It echoes in your words. It radiates from your presence, and people who are still asleep can sense it even if they can't name it. They feel exposed around you, seen in ways that make them deeply uncomfortable. So they protect themselves the only way they know how. They create distance. They build walls of silence. They exclude you from the warmth of belonging, not because you've failed them, but because you've outgrown the roles they needed you to play. Dostoevsky spent his entire life exploring this phenomenon, this terrible gift of seeing too much. In every character he created who suffered from heightened awareness, from Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment to the underground man, from Prince Mishkin to Ivan Karamazov, he documented the same brutal truth. The more clearly you see, the more alone you become. But here's what Dostoevsky discovered that changes everything. This loneliness is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your real life. What you're calling punishment is actually initiation. What feels like exile is actually liberation. What appears as silence from others is actually the first whisper of your own authentic voice finally finding space to speak. You see, most people live their entire lives in what Dostoevsky called the herd, the collective unconsciousness where everyone agrees not to look too closely at anything real. They maintain this agreement through constant noise, constant distraction, constant reinforcement of comfortable narratives. The moment someone among them begins to see clearly, to question honestly, to acknowledge what's actually happening beneath the surface, that person becomes a threat to the entire system. Not because they want to destroy anything, but because their very presence reveals that another way of living is possible. A way that doesn't require lying to yourself. A way that doesn't demand you suppress your perceptions to maintain false harmony. A way that honors truth above comfort. What you've discovered, though you may not have named it yet, is that there are levels of consciousness. Dostoevsky mapped them in his fiction with devastating precision. Most people live at the level of social performance, where the primary goal is to maintain appearances, to be liked, to fit in, to avoid disturbing the surface of things. They've learned to speak in code, to communicate through acceptable lies, to express acceptable emotions while hiding their true feelings. At this level, connection is based on mutual agreement to never look too deep, to never ask the questions that might shatter the comfortable illusions everyone is maintaining. Then there's the level you've reached, the level Dostoevsky himself inhabited, the level of the underground, where you can no longer pretend not to see, where the mechanisms of self-deception have become transparent, where you recognize the patterns that govern human behavior, the fears that drive people's choices, the wounds they're avoiding, the truths they're running from. You see the loneliness hidden behind their laughter. You sense the desperation beneath their confidence. You feel the emptiness they're trying to fill with possessions, achievements, relationships, distractions. And once you see all of this, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to surface level interactions where everyone pretends everything is fine. Your face reveals what you know. Your words carry weight they didn't carry before. Your presence asks questions people don't want to answer, and so they silence you, not with words, but with withdrawal. They stop inviting you into their games because you can no longer play them convincingly. But here's what's happening beneath the surface of this painful isolation. The silence others impose on you is creating space for a different kind of voice to emerge, your own. Dostoevsky understood that true individuality, true authenticity, true spiritual maturity only becomes possible when you're forced out of the collective, when the comfort of belonging is stripped away, when the validation of others is withdrawn, when you're left alone with just yourself and truth. Something remarkable happens. You stop performing. You stop trying to be who others need you to be. You stop twisting yourself into shapes that fit their expectations. And in that raw, undefended space, your actual self begins to breathe. The self that's been buried under layers of social conditioning, family expectations, cultural programming, the self that knows things without being taught, the self that sees clearly without apology, the self that speaks truth even when truth is inconvenient. This is the self that Dostoevsky believed was worth any price to discover, the self that can stand alone without crumbling, the self that doesn't need constant validation to know its own value, the self that can bear the weight of consciousness without breaking. In his notebooks, Dostoevsky wrote about what he called the man who has awakened. This is not someone who has achieved some mystical enlightenment or transcendent bliss. This is simply someone who has stopped lying to themselves, someone who has looked directly at the darkness in their own heart and in the hearts of others, and chosen to acknowledge it rather than deny it. Someone who has seen the suffering that underlies all human existence and decided to face it consciously rather than escape into distraction. This awakening always, always comes with a cost, and that cost is almost always connection, because most people, Dostoevsky observed, will choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths every single time. They will sacrifice depth for belonging. They will suppress their perceptions to maintain harmony. They will betray their own knowing to avoid the terror of standing alone. You cannot do this anymore. Something in you has shifted irreversibly. You can no longer pretend not to notice the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the unspoken agreements that keep everyone playing their assigned roles. You see the suffering people hide. You recognize the masks they wear. You understand the games they play to avoid intimacy, to avoid vulnerability, to avoid the terrifying honesty of real connection. And because you see all of this, people cannot be comfortable around you the way they used to be. They sense that you're asking something of them they're not ready to give. Not words, not explanations, but presence, authenticity, the willingness to drop the performance and be real, even if being real is messy and painful and uncertain. Most people are not ready for that level of honesty, and that's not a judgment against them. It's simply recognition of where they are in their own journey. They're still building their identities, still creating their sense of self through others' opinions, still deriving their worth from external validation, still believing that happiness can be achieved through the right combination of achievements, relationships, and possessions. You've already passed through that stage. You've seen through it. You've recognized it as the beautiful, necessary, but ultimately limited game that it is. And now, you're in the in-between space, no longer comfortable in the old world of illusions, but not yet established in whatever comes next. This is the space Dostoevsky called the underground. It's the space of consciousness that has nowhere to go, no one to speak to, no framework that can hold it. In this space, silence becomes your constant companion, not the silence you choose, but the silence imposed on you by a world that doesn't have room for what you've become. And here's where Dostoevsky's wisdom becomes medicine. He taught that this silence, this forced solitude, this exile from the comfort of belonging is not the universe punishing you. It is the universe preparing you. Think of his character, Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, a man so pure, so genuinely honest, so unable to participate in the games of manipulation and social performance that everyone around him finds him both beautiful and unbearable. They are drawn to him because his presence reminds them of something they've lost, some capacity for genuine feeling and authentic being. But they also can't tolerate him for long because his very existence is a reproach to their own choices, their own compromises, their own willingness to settle for less than truth. Mishkin is isolated not because he lacks love or warmth or the desire for connection. He's isolated because he cannot be false. And in a world built on carefully maintained falsehoods, authenticity becomes the ultimate crime. Or consider Raskolnikov, who commits murder partly to test his own theory that extraordinary people are exempt from ordinary morality, but really because he's trying to prove he's superior to the masses who live in comfortable unconsciousness. His punishment is not just legal, it's existential. He discovers that seeing himself clearly, acknowledging what he's capable of, recognizing the darkness in his own heart, creates an isolation more complete than any prison cell. The silence of guilt, the silence of self-knowledge, the silence of understanding that he is both more and less than he believed himself to be, both more capable of horror and more capable of redemption than his theories allowed for. Or think of Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual who sees too clearly the suffering and injustice in the world to believe in a benevolent God. His atheism is not philosophical posturing. It's the honest response of someone who cannot look away from reality. And this honesty isolates him completely. He cannot find comfort in the faith that sustains others. He cannot pretend that suffering has meaning when he sees innocent children tortured. He cannot participate in the shared delusions that make life bearable for most people. His punishment for seeing clearly is to be trapped in his own mind, unable to escape the logic of his perceptions, unable to find peace in either belief or unbelief. These characters are not failures in Dostoevsky's universe. They are the bearers of consciousness. They are the ones who refuse to sleep when everyone around them is dreaming. And their suffering, their isolation, their punishment of silence is not evidence that they're wrong. It's evidence that they're awake. And what Dostoevsky understood, what he encoded in every one of his novels, is that this awakening is both curse and gift. It's a curse because it separates you from the warm comfort of unconscious belonging. You cannot go back to small talk and surface interactions and pretending that everything is fine when you know it isn't. You cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot unknow what you've learned. But it's also a gift because it opens the door to something deeper, something more real, something that doesn't require you to betray yourself to belong. The silence you're experiencing right now is the space between the old way of being and the new one, between the self that needed others' approval to feel real and the self that knows its own reality without external validation, between the life built on performing for others and the life built on honoring your own truth. This transition is not comfortable. Dostoevsky never pretended it was. In fact, he spent most of his life documenting just how brutal this transition can be. The nights of doubt, the days of crushing loneliness, the moments when you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake, the times when you question whether seeing clearly is worth the price of being alone. But here's what he also discovered on the other side of this silence. If you can bear it long enough, if you can resist the temptation to retreat back into comfortable lies, if you can stay present with the painful truth of your isolation, something begins to shift. You start to hear your own voice more clearly, not the voice that was shaped by others' expectations, but the voice that knows things you've never been taught, the voice that speaks from depths you didn't know you had, the voice that doesn't need anyone's permission to speak truth. You begin to recognize that the silence of others is not the absence of connection. It's the clearing away of false connections to make room for real ones. Most of what you called friendship or love or community before was based on mutual agreement to stay unconscious, to never look too deep, to never ask the questions that might shatter the comfortable surface of things. What you're losing is not real connection. You're losing the illusion of connection, the performance of intimacy without the risk of actually being known. And yes, that loss hurts. It hurts terribly because even false connection is better than no connection when you're afraid of being alone. But Dostoevsky taught that there's something worse than being alone, being surrounded by people and still feeling alone, performing connection while knowing it's hollow, pretending to be understood while carrying the secret knowledge that no one really sees you. That kind of loneliness is more devastating than any solitude because it comes with the added burden of having to pretend it isn't there. At least in actual aloneness, you can be honest. You can stop performing. You can let your face show what you really feel. You can speak out loud the thoughts you've been censoring. You can acknowledge the truth without fear that it will drive someone away, because there's no one left to drive away. And in that space of radical honesty, something miraculous can happen. You might discover that you're not as alone as you thought, that there are others who have seen what you've seen, who have crossed the same threshold, who have been punished with the same silence. They're rare. Dostoevsky knew this. He wrote that conscious individuals are always a minority, scattered throughout the sleeping masses, like stars in a dark sky. They rarely find each other, and when they do, the recognition is instant and profound, because they've been speaking the same language in isolation, waiting for someone who could hear it. When you meet another person who has seen too much, who has been silenced for their clarity, who carries the weight of consciousness without apology, the connection is different from anything you've known before. It doesn't require performance. It doesn't demand that you shrink yourself. It doesn't ask you to pretend. It's based on mutual recognition of truth, on shared understanding of the cost of awareness, on the rare gift of being able to speak honestly without fear of punishment. These connections don't happen often, but when they do, they're worth every moment of silence you endured to find them. They're worth the loneliness of the in-between. They're worth the years of being misunderstood and excluded and quietly erased from spaces that once felt like home. Dostoevsky believed that the purpose of suffering, the purpose of this isolation and silence and punishment for seeing clearly, is to refine you, to burn away everything false until only what's real remains, to strip you of the need for external validation until you can stand on the foundation of your own truth, to teach you that real connection is not about being liked by many, but being truly seen by a few. The silence others impose on you is teaching you to listen to yourself. The distance they create is teaching you to trust your own perceptions. The exile they enforce is teaching you that you don't need their approval to know your own worth. This is not easy wisdom. It doesn't feel like a gift when you're in the middle of it. It feels like death, the death of who you thought you were, the death of the life you thought you were building, the death of the belonging you thought you needed to survive. But Dostoevsky understood that every real transformation requires death. The caterpillar must dissolve completely before it can become a butterfly. The seed must crack open and surrender its form before it can become a tree. The old self must be silenced before the new self can speak. And the silence you're experiencing is not the end of your voice. It's the death of the voice that was never really yours. The voice that spoke only what others wanted to hear. The voice that shaped itself to fit their expectations. The voice that asked permission before it dared to speak truth. What's being born in this silence is your real voice, the one that doesn't need anyone's validation, the one that knows what it knows without needing proof, the one that can bear witness to truth without flinching, the one that can stand alone without breaking. This is the voice Dostoevsky found in his own underground, the voice that wrote some of the most searing, honest, psychologically penetrating literature ever created, the voice that refused to look away from darkness, from suffering, from the complexity of the human soul, the voice that chose truth over comfort, depth over belonging, authenticity over approval. He paid for that voice with years of isolation, with exile to Siberia, with poverty and illness and social rejection, with being misunderstood and criticized and dismissed by the very people he was trying to reach. But he never silenced that voice. He never retreated back into comfortable lies. He never betrayed what he saw in order to be welcomed back into the warmth of collective unconsciousness. And because he didn't, because he bore the weight of his own consciousness without compromise, he created something that outlasted his suffering, something that speaks across time to every person who has ever felt punished for seeing too much, something that says you are not alone in this, you are not crazy, you are not wrong, you are awake in a sleeping world. And that awakening comes with a price, but it also comes with a promise. The promise is this: what you're losing was never real. What you're finding is your actual self, the self that was buried under layers of should and must and supposed to, the self that knows things without being told, the self that sees clearly without apology, the self that can bear the weight of truth without crumbling. This self doesn't need the approval of those who are still asleep. It doesn't require validation from people who refuse to see. It doesn't depend on belonging to spaces that demand you shrink yourself to fit. This self knows its own worth, speaks its own truth, walks its own path, even when that path is lonely, even when that truth is unwelcome, even when that worth is invisible to those who measure value by different standards. The silence you're experiencing is clearing space for this self to emerge fully, to stop whispering and start speaking, to stop hiding and start standing, to stop apologizing and start claiming its right to exist exactly as it is. This emergence is not comfortable, but it's necessary, because you cannot build a real life on a foundation of lies. You cannot create genuine connection while wearing a mask. You cannot find peace by betraying your own knowing. Dostoevsky learned this in the hardest way possible, and he left us a map through the territory of awakening, through the loneliness of consciousness, through the silence that comes when you see too much. So when people withdraw from you, when conversations die in your presence, when you feel the cold weight of their silence settling over your life like snow, remember this: they are not punishing you for being too much. They are protecting themselves from the mirror you've become, a mirror that reflects what they're not ready to see, about themselves, about the world, about the games they're playing. And mirrors have always been dangerous to those who prefer their illusions. But you are not a mirror for their comfort. You are a human being discovering what it means to be awake, to see clearly, to speak honestly, to live authentically, even when that costs you everything familiar, even when it leaves you standing alone in a silence so complete it echoes. Because that silence, that terrible, beautiful silence, is not emptiness, it's space. Space for your real voice to find its volume. Space for your real self to find its ground. Space for real connections to form with others who have made the same journey through darkness into truth. You saw too much, yes, and you're being punished with silence, yes. But what looks like punishment is actually protection. Protection from wasting more of your life in spaces that cannot hold what you've become. Protection from connections that require you to betray yourself. Protection from belonging that costs you your soul. The silence is setting you free, even though it doesn't feel like freedom yet. Even though it feels like exile. One day, you'll look back on this time and recognize it for what it was. Not the end of your story, but the beginning of your real one. The one where you stopped performing and started living. The one where you stopped hiding and started being. The one where you stopped seeking approval and started honoring truth. That story is being written in this silence, word by painful word, and it will be worth every moment of loneliness you endured to tell it. If any part of this reflection found you in the silence, if you recognized yourself in these words, I invite you to share in the comments which aspect of this isolation resonates most deeply with your experience. Your story might be the light someone else needs to keep walking through their own darkness. And if you're ready to continue exploring Dostoevsky's wisdom about the cost and gift of consciousness, about the price of seeing clearly in a world that prefers blindness, subscribe for more of these conversations. We're building something rare here, a space where truth is more valuable than comfort, where depth matters more than popularity, where the few who have awakened can recognize each other across the silence. You are not being punished for seeing too much. You are being initiated into a different way of being human, the way that costs everything familiar but gives you back yourself. Thank you for your courage to keep seeing, even when it would be easier to close your eyes. I'll meet you in the next reflection.